Okay, we'll make a start. So welcome back to day 3. First of all, congratulations for getting to day 3. That's already amazing to see you here. And today's session, I think, is probably the one where people afterwards tell me or send me messages saying that this has really helped them to change the way they're thinking about their future. So I hope that this will be the case for you today. And I would like just to remind you that you do need a piece of paper and a pen, particularly for the last exercise. So if you don't have that handy, do just grab that so that you have it ready for the last part. So we are diving into a topic that comes up for a lot of my clients. A lot of my clients say to me that fear and the need for courage is the key for them, that they really feel the need to look at this question of fear. So when we think of the whole process of change, we've already talked about finding purpose, and I absolutely believe that this is the fundamental part of the process. Then we also need to have the clarity of where we're going and have that plan in place. And then finally, we need the third part of the triangle, if you like, is getting over that fear of change. And interestingly, I would say for 90% of people that I speak to say to me that they are scared of something to do with the change. And what's interesting in midlife, it can be the fear of changing, but it can also be the fear of not changing. So the fear of changing and also the fear of not changing. So it can be very much the two things. So I'd like you to keep that in mind during today's session. The question is, how can we be courageous to make the changes that we really want? So before we start all of that, there's a lot of preparation work to do. If we want a real transformation, we need to do this preparation. And throughout the coaching process, it's ongoing, in fact. We don't do it in one block. It's continuous throughout the whole coaching process. And clients generally, they begin to feel more and more empowered, and it becomes a very positive cycle. Because it's a journey really of personal development, because the more that we feel courageous, the more that we can move forward, the greater the vision that we have, and so on. So it becomes a very a positive cycle with, of course, problems that arise along the way, but that personal development really helps to get over the next hurdle, or the hurdles that come along, which they do. So I would argue that we need to look at 3 elements that are all interlinked before we can make a plan. Now, lots of people want a plan. They want a plan for the future. They want to know what they're doing. They say, but I want to know what I'm going to do. What can I do? Now, before we get to that plan, there are 3 things that I think we need to be clear on. First of all, how can we build that muscle of being courageous? Secondly, how can we harness that inner voice, that little voice that tells us sometimes, you can't do that. Who do you think you are? And why do you think you can do that? And all of a sudden, oh, that's not possible for you. You've never done that before. That's definitely not possible for you. Or whatever that inner voice is saying when it's not being helpful, how can we change that? How can we train it, in fact, to be really helpful and to be on our side? So that's the second thing. The third thing is giving ourselves permission to, in fact, create a vision of the future that is full of purpose. Not just a small vision, but a big vision. And to really look beyond our normal limits. So, for example, if we think about how we plan a lot of the time, it might be, well, what am I going to do for the next holiday? Or what are we doing for Christmas? Or I must write my shopping list. Whatever those those smaller plans, they can really easily overtake that need to look at the long-term future. And there are lots of reasons for that, and they'll be different for everybody. But allowing ourselves to be able to think about that. Yes, Mark says, what's for tea? Absolutely. That's a lot of the planning we're doing, isn't it? What's for tea? What's coming? What's coming next in the very next couple of days? But allowing ourselves to think much bigger gives us a lot of courage. So we're going to come back to that. So first one, how do we transform fear into courage? So when we're at a crossroads in our career, there are so many fears, aren't there? And as I said, there's the fear of not changing. And, I don't want to be like this in the next 10 years. But there's also, on the other hand, the fear of changing. Can I change? Can I do that? Is it possible? What's going to happen? What's going to be the impact on everybody else in my life? So there's a fear, and we can feel very stuck in the middle. Well, what do? I can't do that side. I can't do that side. What can I do? So we want to change, and we don't want to change. And we can feel very, very squeezed in the middle. So today we're talking about that fear, that kind of paralyzing fear. And of course, it's different for everyone. It's perhaps the fear of being overly ambitious, for example, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of rocking the boat. Now, this is a big one for people in midlife. The fear of rocking the boat that's actually quite good. The fear of rocking a boat that's quite comfortable. We know what it is. It's a boat that we know. So it's the fear of the unknown. But it's also, as I said, how will I feel if I wake up in 5 years and things are still the same? The fear of being stuck. And then there's the fear of stepping outside my comfort zone. If I decide to take that step, how am I going to find the courage to step into that new role? Can I do that? So as I briefly mentioned yesterday, one very simple way to start is to see fear differently. So physiologically, fear is very similar to excitement. So you have butterflies in your stomach, maybe your hands are sweaty, maybe your knees literally shake. In many situations, we can say to ourselves, I feel fear, but I want excitement. So we can actually try to see the other side of the coin. So I want you to think of a time where you have felt that fear of something new. So maybe something at work, something at home, just think of one time where you've been in a situation where you have felt that fear. Maybe it's before an interview, before giving a presentation. Could be lots of things, before negotiating a pay rise, whatever it is. Think about that time and think about, well, could I, in that situation, decide, okay, I'm feeling fear, but what I want to do is feel excitement. Now, this works because, in fact, emotions are just data. And emotions, we can accept those emotions. So we can say, okay, I accept that I'm feeling fearful. I accept that I'm feeling worried. But we don't have to stay stuck in that tunnel, as it were. And this is where being fearful or not feeling courageous becomes a problem, when we get stuck in that tunnel, where I don't have the courage. I can't do it. I'm too scared. And we stay stuck in that tunnel. But there's a very, very quick way out of that tunnel. Is I accept that I feel that fear. I'm not saying that we have to be positive thinking. No, because it doesn't work. What I'm saying is we accept that fear, and then we say, but I would prefer to feel something else. And it's a really amazing technique, because it sounds like it can't possibly be true, but actually I've used it a number of times with clients, and amazingly, it works very, very quickly. I remember working with one client, it was back at the beginning of the year, and he was very worried because he had to have a very difficult conversation with somebody in his team, and he knew it was going to be very hard, and he was feeling very fearful about it, very anxious. He wasn't sure how this the other person was going to react, so he was worried about the reaction. And I asked him, well, what would you prefer to feel? And he said, I would rather feel confident that I'm doing the right thing. And then he looked at me and just laughed. And I said, oh, what happened? And he said, I feel confident that I'm doing the right thing. And then he laughed again because he'd spent a week worrying about it. And it sounds very improbable, but try it. And if you want more information about that, there's a fantastic book called Emotional Agility by Susan David. She is an American psychologist, and I often talk about her in my podcasts if you're interested in this. And I really recommend getting that. It's also available in French. I have the French version as well. It's L'Agilité Émotionnelle. And it's a very interesting book. And she talks a lot about how we can transform and manage emotions, and how emotions are just data. And this is, I think, one of the keys to feeling courageous. It means that we can accept, as I say, we can accept the emotion. We're not saying it doesn't exist, but we can also choose to have another one. There's lots of other things that she talks about to do with that, which we haven't got time to talk about today. But I do recommend that if that's something that you're interested. So I'm just going to give you some other questions that can also help in this situation when we want to feel courageous. There's one big question. Can you afford not to make the change? Now, this is an important one because when we're thinking about making changes in our lives, we have to be very careful. The name of the book. Yes, it is Emotional Agility. Emotional Agility by Susan David. I'll put it in the chat at the end as well. And I'll send the link out tomorrow to everybody who's signed up for the challenge. So I'll make sure I put the link in the email. Yes. So going back to the question that I think is a very useful one: can you afford not to make the change? And I think for many of us, the discomfort of staying stuck eventually overpowers the desire to change. But it's very important that we look at the consequences. What are the consequences of making that change? But what are the consequences of not making the change? And we do need to look very carefully at both of those, not just assume that change is the answer. It may not be. So let's be very careful about that. For coaching generally to be successful, you need to be really at that point where you do want some kind of change. And you need to know that actually the time is now. You want to make the change right now. Coaching doesn't generally help people who are still at the point where they're having to think through a lot of things from the past that can be quite painful. That's a different step. Coaching is not therapy, and the two things are very useful and differently useful at different points in people's lives. So that's an important point to remember. So if we're ready for coaching, we must be able to say yes, that we do want some kind of change. We might not know what that change is, but we must be ready for it and ready for that shift. I must be ready to say, I want this transformation and I want to become the best version of myself. It doesn't matter if you don't know the how or if you doubt that it's possible, but you must want it. And that also helps with courage when you really want it, when you want that change. And it can take time, and that's okay. So the second thing, let's look a little bit more into this inner voice. So in your workbook, the first thing about the inner voice is a very interesting point, I think, because firstly, the inner voice is there to protect you. You may think that that inner critic is a real pain, and it can be, but in fact, what it wants to do is protect you. It has a good intention. What it's adapted to protect you from physical dangers, from uncertainty, from disruption, essentially. And basically, your inner voice doesn't like change. It wants to keep you in the safe place that you are right now. So there are many aspects to this that I work on with my clients. And one of the most powerful that I think that we can do as a group is firstly become very aware simply of how we speak to ourselves. Because how we speak to ourselves shows us what we are thinking. And why is this important? Because what we're thinking determines what we do. Let me give you a very, very practical example of this. So I feel cold and I'm thinking, I'm cold. I can't bear to be cold. So what do? I go and turn on the heating. Someone else in our house, who will remain nameless, thinks, I'm cold. It's October. Of course it's cold. That's normal. The action, I put on a jumper. Different response comes from the different thinking. Same initial emotion, I'm feeling cold, different outcome because the thinking was different. Now that's a very basic idea, but you get the idea. It's all about what we're thinking. That's and what we believe, by the way, what we're thinking and what we believe, and then that determines what we actually do. So the inner voice is very important because the inner voice is affecting us all the time. It's telling us, it's giving us these messages all the time that are then influencing what we actually do. So one very important strategy is mastering that inner critic and retraining it, because that inner voice is just key. And it changes the way that we actually show up in the world. This idea of influence, and when something is very close to us, isn't new. I'm sure that if you have children, you're very aware of the influence that other children can have on our children. So sometimes good, sometimes not. So I'm sure if you think about your own friends and family and people you work with, who you spend time with has an effect on us. And just going back very quickly to medieval times, I loved studying medieval history. And in medieval times, it was well known that the most powerful people in government, in medieval government, were those in the Privy Council. And these were the people that literally helped the monarch to go about his or her daily ablutions. So the Privy Council was the person helping the king or the queen in the bathroom. That was the person with the most power in medieval England anyway. Maybe says something about us. So, because they had his or her ear, they had access all the time to the king or the queen. And that consistent voice that we have in our ear, whether it's a person or not, is very influential. But in fact, our own inner voice is what we have in our ears all the time. We cannot afford not to be aware of what that inner voice is saying. Because what we are listening to in our heads all the time, our inner voice influences us. Because we are the greatest influence on ourselves. And I'm going to say that again because I think it's probably the most important sentence of the entire session today. We are the greatest influence on ourselves. Now that has two sides to it, doesn't it? Firstly, it means that we have to take responsibility, but also that gives us such possibilities to change that and a willingness to change that because we know that it can have such an impact. We can choose how we're thinking and acting, so we have control over that. And in coaching, we learn how to do that. We learn how to control that inner voice and how to use it to our advantage. Now, I can't do that with all of you in one session, but what we can do is one small exercise. So in your workbook here now, you will find a section here that talks about the intention of the inner voice. So the intention, as I've said, is to serve us. It's helping to protect us from danger. But the problem is that that danger is not always a real danger now. That inner voice was from way back when we needed to be careful about being eaten or not being able to find enough food, and from those prehistoric times. So that is all outdated. The world has changed, but that inner voice has not, in fact. But now we can afford to allow that inner voice to develop and to change. So I'll just give you a very concrete example of how this can work. So I work with a lot of adults in my language school, and we use a lot now, since I've done my coaching training, we talk a lot about retraining the inner voice so that they can reach their potential when they're learning English. And I had a student recently who is a senior leader in a company. And after his first lesson with one of our staff, where we noticed that he was quite stressed, I spoke to him and I asked him how it went. And he said, "Oh, I'm rubbish at English. Je suis nul en anglais." And that he couldn't understand anything, that it was too difficult. He couldn't find his words, and the list went on. There were lots of things. And so when he'd finished that, I asked him to imagine that he was sitting next to a child who had said all of those things. And I asked him to tell me, what would he say to that child who was saying, "I'm rubbish at English, I can't do it, I'll never manage it, I can't find my words." And he said what you would expect. He said, "Well, I would say, keep trying, you'll make progress. Making mistakes is how you learn. Everyone starts there. You do a little bit every day. Every day it will make a difference. Just small steps and you'll see that it makes a difference." And as I said to him, I said, "Well, so what would happen if you said that to yourself?" And he looked at me and just went, "Oh yeah, I've got it now." Just like that. And it's that inner voice. Suddenly he realized what he had been saying to himself was not helping, and what he needed to hear was that gentle, encouraging advice. So when people ask, who has been the biggest influence on your life, be in no doubt that you are the loudest person in your head. You are the biggest influence on your life, but also that you can reset that voice. And it's very powerful. So what kind of leader do you need to be for the future that you want? What does that best version of you look like? All these things are so important because you need that inner voice to help you to answer those questions. So I'm now going to ask you to do an exercise that can be quite an emotional one because it involves digging deep. And what I would like you to do, in your workbook, you will see that there is a space for you to write. What is your inner voice saying to you that is not helping you? So I want you to think about that. What is your inner voice saying to you on a regular basis that is not helping you? And then in your workbook, I want you to write down, what do you want your inner voice to be saying to you? What do you want your inner voice to be saying to you? And I want you to write down at least 3 things. I want you to write down 3 things that you would like your inner voice to be saying to you. And really use your words because it's your inner voice. What do you want that inner voice to say to you? So as you're writing down those 3 things, I just want you to notice how that feels. And you've got your microphone off, so I'd like you to actually say it out loud. Say those 3 things out loud to yourself. And really check that those are the things that you want. And I want you to decide that you're going to notice. You're going to notice when that inner voice is not helpful. And you're going to tell it to stop. And instead you're going to invite the new voice to come in. It's not going to be automatic. You know, for some of us, we've had the same inner voice for many years. So it takes time. Takes time, but just notice when you hear it and tell it to be quiet. That in itself helps by telling it to be quiet, by telling it to move away. There are lots of ways we can do this, in fact, and for some people they can hear that voice. For some people it's an image, a picture, or even it can be a color. I remember one client told me that for him the inner voice was like a big gray cloud, and that when he pushed it away there was blue sky behind. And I thought that was a lovely image of that negative inner critic, and that he was able to push the clouds. It was almost like, you push the clouds, but the blue sky is there, and it's much more solid and permanent. It's always there behind the clouds. So I thought that was a lovely one. But it's going to be different for everybody. Okay, I'm going to leave you to think about that and maybe come back to that yourselves after the session. And we're going to move on to the 3rd part of this preparation work towards having lots of courage. And this is really about allowing ourselves to create a vision of a future that is full of purpose. And giving ourselves permission to dream big is very powerful. And it's something I've been talking to some of you about actually today. In fact, 2 or 3 people today I've been talking to about this, about the necessity to think big. And the power of that, of having this Disney planning, I call it. And so this is where you don't think about the constraints, you think about all the possibilities and the constraints we can leave behind. So by the end of tonight's session, I hope that you're going to have something very concrete to take away, a plan, a vision of the future that I hope is going to be very, very big. So when we're telling stories, it's very important, isn't it? Because how we build our own story, it builds our identity. Have you ever noticed that when people tell their story, they're building that image of themselves that we're getting. So they're creating an identity. So how we tell our story, that becomes our identity. And with this exercise, how we tell our future story is going to become what our future identity is going to be, because we can create the story. You create your own story for the future. We can create our identity, and we can decide how we want it to be. And we can decide what that best version of ourselves is going to be. And this shapes what we do and what we believe is possible. And it changes so many things when we start thinking about what is our future story going to be. So today you are going to start creating that identity of that best version of you. So how do we do this? So we're going to look at a way of writing your future history, your history that has great purpose in it. And what you're going to do is you are going to write a letter to yourself, and you're going to write your own story about where you will be in a year's time. So you're going to imagine that it's 1 year from now. So it's October 2022. That's the date on the letter. And you have done all this work. You imagine you've done this work. You have retrained that inner voice. And you're going to think about what is important to you. Think about what your purpose is. Think about how you're going to have energy to do what you want to do. And I want you to write a letter to yourself, congratulating yourself on everything that you have done, on the changes you have made, on the decisions that you have taken, and how you're feeling right now. So I'm going to just repeat that again because it's quite a strange concept. So in your letter, you're going to write it to yourself. So I would say, Dear Anne. The date is October 2022. I'm going to step into October 2022. So in a year. And I'm going to think, what am I feeling right now? What am I doing with my life? What decisions have I made? How have things developed over the last year? And most importantly, how am I feeling? Now, this is very important, especially for those who are not yet clear on what that purpose is. Think about how you want to be feeling this time next year. Because the nitty-gritty, the planning will come later. So don't worry. Don't worry too much about saying exactly, well, I've done this and I've done that. It's about how you're feeling in that moment and how proud you are of the changes that you've made. How are you different? What is that best version of you? How are you turning up in the world? So I'm going to give you 15 minutes. And for those listening on the podcast, please press pause because I'm not going to leave 15 minutes of silence on your recording and then continue. For those on the Zoom, you've now got 10 to 15 minutes to write your letter. And if you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat. I suggest that you turn off your camera so that you can really have total peace and quiet. But if you have any questions at all, just send me a message and I will answer those. So you have 10 to 15 minutes to write your letter. For those on Zoom, do feel free to put your cameras back on. If you haven't quite finished, then I hope you can find a little slot of time to continue with that exercise. We will have a quick discussion about that when we've finished the recording here. So hold on to all of those thoughts about how you found that exercise. So your homework for tonight is to read your letter aloud to yourself. And if you can, to tell someone else what you've written, because by doing that, you start to have that bit of accountability. Well, what are the decisions that maybe you've taken or that you want to take that are clear in your letter? And just by telling somebody else, it maybe helps to make it a little bit more concrete. So feel free to definitely read it aloud to yourself, but also try to discuss it with someone else if you wish. So to recap then, we've looked at 3 elements that need to be in place to help you feel really courageous and before you start to design fully that future full of purpose. So the first thing is getting the courage to change, really finding that courage to change and thinking about how to manage emotions. Secondly is training that inner voice so that it's on your side and that it's helping you, serving you. And thirdly, to have that big vision of the future. And the key is the word big. Making that vision as big as possible. If you normally go to there, it's a bit like seeing the end of the garden. You know, if that's the end of the garden normally, go much further. Take it, give yourself permission to go much further beyond the garden fence. So today, congratulations, you have made a wonderful start on all of that. And already I hope that you have some clarity on that future and how it might look for you. And do continue to work on it. It's as I've said all along, this week it just gives you a little taster of what coaching can do. And it just gives you the starting point. So do continue with that work. So tomorrow we're going to be looking at how you can make that plan even bigger and open up your mind to bigger possibilities, to being the best version of yourself. Plus, I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about what coaching looks like, and we will have a bit of a chance to discuss that as well. Now, I just want to bring your attention to the fact that I made a series of podcasts this summer, so that was August 2021, called The Inner Voice, and I think there are 5 or 6 episodes. So if you're interested in that idea of the inner voice, I go into a lot more detail about how you can retrain your inner voice. So do go on to our podcast, which is Leaders Who Love What They Do, and just go back a few episodes and you will find there's a whole series that I did during the summer months called the Inner Voice podcast series. So if you're interested in having a call with me, if you haven't yet had your 10-minute Connect call, please do click on the link in the email or in the show notes and book up that call. We still have till the end of the week. Places are now a little bit limited, but there are a few slots left. And of course, you can also make an appointment for the middle of November when I'm back from my holiday next week, which I'm very excited about as well. So if you can't find a time that suits you, please let me know and we will definitely find a good time. So that's all for tonight. Thank you to everybody who has come to the Zoom. Thank you for everybody who's listening on the replay. Once again, thank you to all those people, particularly in Asia, who are tuning in 12 hours afterwards to listen to the replays. Thank you, and I hope that you are enjoying it as well. And I'm sorry that the times don't make it possible for you to join us live. So thank you very much. For those on Zoom, please do stay and join us for a very quick discussion before we say goodnight. Thank you all very much.